Once we understand how banks create money, it's useful to talk about the money supply overall, how much money is in the economy, and then we can talk about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy tools. Again, this is something that will be particularly relevant as the Fed moves to ease some of the burden of this global pandemic we're facing. Before we can talk about the policy prescriptions, we need to first talk about measurement. To understand money, banking, and ultimately the monetary policy of the US government, we must first understand how the money supply is measured. Without understanding how it's measured, we can't understand how it's manipulated. So there's a lot of different ways we can measure the money supply. And they move from more to less liquid. So M1 is the primary way of measuring the money supply, and it is the most liquid forms of money. It's currency and checkable deposits. That means bank deposits that allow you to withdraw money by writing checks. This measure of the money supply has grown less useful as we've developed new ways of accessing money, but it's still the most widely used and the most liquid. So, what are some other ways we measure? There's also M2, which is everything that's in M1 plus savings deposits, money market and mutual funds, and CDs. What a CD means here is a certificate of deposit. M2 includes all of M1 plus other less liquid assets. So, when we're thinking about things that increase the money supply, would a birthday check from your grandparents increase the money supply? No, because it's just moving from one checking account to another, from theirs to yours. It's just a transfer. What about when you take money out of your savings account and put it in your checking account? Well, it doesn't increase the size of M2, but it does increase the size of M1, that liquid money supply. What we're going to find out is that the thing that most increases money supply is activity by the Federal Reserve. So here we have two measures of the money supply, M1 and M2, shown graphically, because they're the most common measures. Just to refresh your memory, M1 is currency, cash, and checkable deposits. And M2 is everything that's in M1 and some other stuff. So, because it's everything and then more, M2 is always going to be larger than M1. But what's not immediately clear until we see the graph is how much larger. M2 is readily available money, but because it's in M2, it suggests that consumers might not think of it that way. So when we think about measuring the money supply, it's also useful to think about what's not in the money supply. So here we have two very common ways people spend money, debit and credit cards. And debit cards are just tied to our checking account, so essentially they are part of M1. They allow easy transfer in and out. But what about credit cards? Credit cards are not part of the money supply, and it's useful to think about the difference between a debit and a credit card. Because what a credit card is essentially an IOU. When you are at a cash register and you swipe your credit card, what you are saying is, my credit card company, American Express, is going to pay you the money I owe you right now, and I will pay that money back to them at a later date. What this means is that credit cards are not tied to those measures of the money supply we've seen, that checking account, that currency, those less liquid deposits like your savings account. Credit cards are essentially loans made on spot. So, we're trying to measure the money supply, And there should be a key word that jumps out at you when I say money supply, which is supply. This concept, this relationship that we've been talking about for a couple weeks now. The amount at which producers are willing and able to bring to market at a given price. Well, when we're talking about money supply, we're talking about the amount which of money people are willing and able to bring to market. And when we talked about this supply relationship, we talked about changing the underlying relationship. And to do that, we talked about shifting the curve. Well, how can we shift the supply of money? Shifts in the supply of money take place due to the central bank. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve Bank. And how can the Fed shift our money supply? How can they increase the money supply when people are cash strapped like they are right now? Well, they can change reserve requirements, although this is quite rare. They can change the discount rate, although this is quite rare. And we're not going to define what those are right now. Or they can conduct open market operations. These types of policies they're conducting, these monetary policies, are done to achieve goals with an eye towards the entire economy. These goals are threefold: encourage production, control inflation, keeping in mind that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary problem, and to limit unemployment. These goals are achieved via relatively easy monetary policy, which is by increasing the ease which people and businesses can access money, we are able to encourage production and limit unemployment. This, of course, goes counter to that middle goal of controlling inflation. The idea is to finesse our monetary expansion. We want just enough growth of the money supply that people are able to stabilize in terms of unemployment and businesses are able to keep producing, but not so much that inflation gets out of hand. To understand this better, to close out our lecture, I've dropped another video into the description for you, and that's from the St. Louis Fed explaining exactly how the Federal Reserve Bank works. If anyone is interested in this, when I was in Atlanta, I worked at the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I'm quite familiar with it. So if you guys are interested, please reach out to me and we can talk more about the Fed. Till next time, thank you so much.